Hey guys, and welcome to a League of Legends team roles video. In today's video, we will be going over the different roles in League of Legends and the positions you should be playing them in. Hey guys, before we get started with the video, check out these timestamps if you're just looking for a specific position. In League of Legends, there's a ton of different roles that you can fill for your team. However, these roles are usually specific to a certain position. Those positions are going to be top, mid, jungle, AD carry, and support. So let's go over which roles you can play in each position. The top lane roles that are most commonly found in League of Legends are going to be our tanky engage roles and our split pushing and really strong duelist roles. To fulfill these two roles, we're going to have three types of champions in the top lane. We're going to have tanky champions, we're going to have bruiser champions, and then we're going to have some mages. If you're thinking about picking a top lane tank champion, you're going to want to make sure that you have two things. The first thing is going to be some survivability during the laning phase, either through shields or through some healing, because tanks are generally weaker in the early game. The second thing you're going to want to make sure you have is some reliable, long-ranged CC. That way you can start fights for your team when you need to. If you're thinking about picking a bruiser in the top lane, you're probably going to be fulfilling a split pushing role. So there's a few things that you want to make sure you have. The first thing is a kit meant for fighting in 1v1 and 1v2 scenarios. The second thing is a little bit of mobility, just in case you can't fight in those 1v1 and 1v2 scenarios. And the third thing is you're going to want to make sure that your kit is a little bit based off of auto attacks in order to take down those structures you're split pushing for. The last type of champion we'll be seeing in the top lane are going to be those mages. Now, mages can either fulfill the tanky and engage role or the split pushing and dueling role, depending on which one you pick. However, most mages are kind of weak in the early game, so to survive you're going to want one of two things. Either some good reliable mobility to escape or later in the game engage, or some targeted CC to stop threats that are chasing you while you run away. Mid lane is going to be one of the most dynamic positions for roles that can be applied to it. So for this video, we're just going to talk about the two main ones that you'll find here in middle lane. Those two roles are going to be mages and assassins. As with every role and the champions that fill them, the kits tend to have some similarities, and that is no different for our mid lane mages. For the mid lane mages, we're going to have three major similarities that we'll talk about. The first thing that makes mid lane mages so popular is their ability to wave clear the minion waves during the middle to late game. This is especially true when enemy teams are trying to siege your structures. You're going to be able to clear out those minions away from your tower in order to successfully defend. This is really important and one of the major factors in why mid lane mages are so popular. Another common thing among most of mid lane mage kits is their lack of mobility. This is also part of why they go mid lane. Without the ability to really dash or blink away from danger, the option to have a tower that's close to them to run to in order to help defend themselves is the best case scenario. So our mid lane mages will lack mobility, and that's part of why they go mid lane. The last common trait about the mid lane mages is that they tend to be weaker in the early game when they're trying to farm up and gather their items, but they tend to be extremely strong, maybe even the strongest class in the game, around the mid to late game, that in between right there. So mid lane mages tend to have some good wave clear, low mobility, but are really strong in the mid to late game. Now we can talk a little bit about the mid lane assassins, which are almost the exact opposite of the mid lane mages we just talked about. The first major thing we're going to definitely want in our assassin kit is a way to get over walls without a target. This allows us to move around the map freely, quickly, and find those targets that we do want to catch. The second thing to note about assassins is that they usually have a strong early to mid game. A lot of their power spikes are usually at level 3, at level 6 when they get their ultimate, and most of the time in the early to mid game. The last really important thing to note about assassins is that while if they do get super far ahead, they can annihilate their target and win team fights, more often than not, what's going to happen is those assassins are going to turn into split pushers who are going to go off the side lanes and look for smaller fights where their assassin capabilities help them out a lot more. Or when they split push, the enemy team is going to try to defend, and while everyone is moving over to that tower, they try to pick somebody off. The next position on our list that we're going to be talking about are going to be the junglers. Now there's usually two different types of roles that fill the jungler position, and that are going to be the early game skirmishers and the kind of late game team fighters. For our early game skirmishers, they prefer to get into smaller fights and are stronger in the earlier game, so 1v1s and 2v2s are kind of their favorite thing. As for the team fighter and tanky junglers, they usually want to scale up into the later game where they can take advantage of their team fighting kits and a lot of their AoE CC that they have in order to help out their teams. Something that's going to be super common among most junglers is that they're going to have a movement ability. Now that can either be a skill shot that brings you to your target, that can be a dash, it can be a blink, and it can even be a movement speed buff. But most junglers will have one of these four options. First up, let's talk about the skirmisher role. For the skirmisher role, we're going to have a few things that are going to be extremely common, but there's one major thing, and that is that a lot of their abilities are single target focused. This means that they're better in smaller fights in the 1v1s, 2v2s, and 3v3 type situations, but they definitely fall off when there's more than one target that they should or want to be hitting because they can't. Another thing that makes skirmisher junglers is their ability to rely on their mobility. This allows them to find the fights, the smaller ones they want to get into, those 1v1s and 2v2s, but it also allows them to avoid the bigger fights that they don't want to get into. Now let's talk a little bit about the other role, which is going to be the tankier and team fighter type champions. Now something that a lot of people are going to try and tell you is that these champions shouldn't be ganking that often. However, this is not true. The job of the jungler is to try and impact the lanes during the early game, and tanky type champions do this as well. The only difference is how often they want to do it or how forced they can make a gank. Now our tanky junglers are going to have some pretty common things amongst them. The first thing is that they're going to have a lot of AoE style clear for the jungle. So while they aren't as good at really single targeting out those buffs or the smaller camps, they can farm slightly better overall. This means that they're okay at farming, but they don't really want to get into those 1v1 fights because their abilities aren't meant to hit only one target. Another thing that's going to be super common among these tanky teamfighter junglers is their ability to affect teamfights using crowd control. A lot of them have AoE crowd control, which means they can affect or stop the movement of multiple targets with one ability. So every extra target they hit makes that ability that much more impactful, and that is really why they love fighting over objectives and in 5v5 type teamfights. Next up on our list is going to be one of the two roles that populate in the bottom lane, and that's going to be our attack damage carries. Now, as the name implies, attack damage carries rely mostly on their auto attacks for a lot of their damage. Since auto attacks are usually amplified by items more than anything else, AD carries are going to want a lot of them. So, in general, AD carries scale the best with the game and are usually the most damage output in the game towards the later stages. Now, we're going to split off the AD carry position into two roles. Now, don't be mistaken, all AD carries do rely a lot on their auto attacks, but there are two different types of roles that will be put into this position. That are going to be the auto attack based AD carries and the caster and ability based AD carries. The single most common thing that you'll see among the auto attack based AD carries is that they build a lot of critical strike chance and attack speed. These two stats are always going to be the best for amplifying those auto attacks that you rely so much on. Now, because you really do rely on items to increase those auto attacks, your early game is pretty weak. That means that until you get around your third item, and that's your third major item, that doesn't include boots, you're usually not that strong. 2 items, you're okay, but 3 items and above is where you really take off. The last thing to note about our auto attack AD carries is that because they always scale more and more and more with every item they get, they're usually by far the strongest damage output class in the game when everyone has their full amount of items. On the flip side, we're going to have our caster AD carries, which in general for caster AD carry traits, they usually build more attack damage than attack speed. Now, the reason why they really like attack damage over attack speed is because flat attack damage usually amplifies abilities more than attack speed. And since we have caster AD carries, you're going to be hitting with an auto attack and then usually weaving in abilities as much as possible. So attack damage is usually the better go-to. Now, in direct comparison to the auto attack based AD carries, our caster AD carries are going to come out ahead in the early to mid game. But after that, our caster AD carries are usually the weaker of the two. The last position we will be talking about is support, and we have 3 different types of roles that can fit into this position. Now, even though we have 3 different types of roles that'll fit, there are some common things among all of the supports that you'll want to know about. The first thing we need to understand about supports is why some champions can be a support and why other champions cannot. And that all comes down to the support kit. The kit of the champion itself is usually strong by itself and doesn't need items to do what it has to do. In fact, items may not even make it that much better. And since items cost gold and we don't need them, we go to the support role, where we protect the attack damage carry who will be gathering all the gold from that lane while we're there protecting them. Now, with all that being said, what are the 3 types of supports that you'll see? That's going to be our tank supports, our healers and peelers, and we're also going to have some damage supports. Now, for the tanky supports, there's 2 things that we're definitely going to have. We're going to have a way to engage using our abilities, which usually also incorporate crowd control, and we're also going to have a sort of damage mitigation. Either that is a shield, some sort of heal, or a way to reduce damage straight up. For our heal and peel type champions, we're usually going to have 2 things as well. The first thing is a targeted shield or heal that we can use on our allies to help them out, and we're also going to have a form of CC that isn't for engage, but for defensive capabilities, like knockbacks, knockups, and even sometimes a silence. For damage supports, we're going to have a few things. But first, I want to make sure that you guys understand that as a support position, you definitely want to focus on vision control as well as damage if you're taking this type of role. Now, for the damage supports, you're usually going to have 2 things. One is an okay form of CC, usually not targeted and usually not super reliable. And the second thing you're going to have is great amounts of magic damage. We never see a damage support that is attack damage based, because they usually require more items to be strong. Alright guys, it's time for a quick recap. Top lane is either going to have tanky teamfighters, split pushing bruisers that are mostly AD based, or mages that can also split push or teamfight depending on which mage you pick. Mid lane is going to have mages that love wave clearing but have low mobility, or assassins that like to pick off squishy targets. Our junglers are going to be skirmishers who like early game 1v1 and 2v2 type fights, or team fighters that like to impact team fights later on 5v5s with a lot of AoE CC. The bottom lane is going to be paired up with the AD carry, who is either auto attack based or caster and ability based, with a support that's going to be a tank, heal and peel, or damage. Well guys, that wraps it up for our basic overview of the different positions and roles that fill those positions in League of Legends. Below the video or on our website at ladderup.gg, you will find an article that explains more in depth some of the things that we talked about. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.